Vidya Shankar. He completed his B Architecture from National Institute of Technology, Tiruchirappalli. He did his graduate training with architect Kukke Subramania, Bangalore, which was his initiation into the design practice. He then went on to pursue his Masters in Architecture from CEPT University, Ahmedabad, specializing on architecture, theory and design. During the years 2007-2010, he was working as an associate architect with the architect P.G. Sivakumar, Tiruchirappalli from Tamil Nadu, where gained design experience on varieties of projects ranging from college campuses to small residences. He then scaled heights by working with the architect Dean de Cruz, Goa, during the years 2013 to 2014. He received the opportunity to work on projects of intense design explorations with a master architect on varieties of projects including an art gallery, boutique hotel, housing and residential projects, all in Goa. Today, Vidya Shankar stands to be an esteemed visiting lecturer at few reputed architectural schools in Trichy, where he continues his academic interests through teaching.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series. We are going to see about the subject Theory of Architecture 1. First, we will see the unit 1 out of the 5 units, which is the Introduction to Architecture. The contents of the units 1 are as follows. First is the definition of architecture. Next, we will see about the discipline of architecture, and then we will see about the origin of architecture. Definitions of architecture. How do we define architecture? We can start with a very simple definition of architecture. Architecture is the art and science of designing buildings. But is it just about the buildings? For example, if we see this picture, there is a building and there are spaces inside and there are spaces outside. This building is essentially about the space that is created inside. In this other example from Gothic architecture, if you see, there is a tall, vast interior space flooded with beautiful light inside the cathedral. That is the main aim of this architecture. So we have to redefine the definition of architecture, saying that it is the art and science of designing spaces. Now we have to ask the next question, is it about only the spaces inside the building? We can find answer in this next example. The pyramids of Egypt doesn't have any big space inside the building. It has a very small space inside the building, but it is all about creating a vast, magnificent, beautiful space outside the building in this plain desert of Sahara. We will see another example to explain the same. This building is an example from our own country, a Buddhist stupa in Sanchi. In this building also, there is no space inside at all, not even a small single space. So the architecture is about creating a meaningful activity space around the building. So now we have to go back and redefine our definition, saying that architecture is the art and science of designing spaces both inside the building and outside the building. Moment we speak about the space outside building, a new element comes into picture, that is the nature around the building. Every building built has a beautiful natural environment around it, and also it has an artificial environment inside it. There have to be a beautiful harmony between this inside artificial environment and the outside natural environment. There are architects who have created this harmony. For example, in this building called Falling Waters, designed by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, have brought the harmony between the man-made architecture and the beautiful nature by incorporating the natural waterfall inside the building and also the natural stones inside the building. So now we can redefine the definition, saying that architecture is the art and science of designing built environment. Now we move into the next discussion of looking into what all the discipline of architecture involves in it. How do we call the person who designs architecture as? He is called the architect. Also, we have to clarify to ourselves what does the term architecture means. Architecture means two things. It means the built product, which is the architectural building. Also, it means the activity of designing. So, it means both the noun and also the verb. What sort of an activity is the designing of architecture? Is it purely a scientific activity or is it an artistic activity? We had seen in our definition before that it is both art and science, but we will see how it is so. Architecture involves in it the sciences regarding the building construction, sciences regarding nature, sciences regarding the people who are using the building, and also sciences regarding the people around the building. We can call it as society. So, it involves all these following sciences within it. Now, we will see in detail regarding all these points individually. First, we will see about science regarding the construction. Even to build a very small building, an architect should have a very good understanding of how the building materials reacts to nature around it. He have to have a very good understanding of the forces acting in the building material and the buildings. For example, he have to understand how the gravity acts and how the wind forces act. Like this, he have to understand many sciences regarding the building construction and the materials. This is the first aspect. And the second aspect, if you see, the building is not just the building. It involves many natural forces around the building. For example, a building deals with the heat, the building deals with the sunlight, it deals with the ground on which it is sitting, it deals with the wind that is blowing into the building. So, an architect who is designing a building have to have a very good understanding of all these forces that is there in the nature around. Only then he can design a building which is in a very good harmony with the nature around. The above said second point can be explained with an example. If you see these two pictures, it shows a residential settlement, one from the state of Rajasthan, other from the state of Tamil Nadu. An architect can design a good building only if he understands the climate of the region. A house in Rajasthan has to be designed very differently from a house in Tamil Nadu, because the climatic condition is very different there in Rajasthan compared to the climatic condition in Tamil Nadu. So, these aspects of science he have to incorporate in his buildings. The third point, an architect has to have a very good understanding of the people who are the users of the building. For example, if an architect has to design a building for a poet or an artist compared to a building for a very busy businessman, the house will be obviously very different. He can't design a very good building without understanding the characters of the people using it. If we go further, we can understand that the architect has to have a very good understanding of the people around the building also, which means the entire society. A building in a place have to respond to the people in the entire society, so that the people in the building are in very good harmony with the society. With above all these explanations, we can understand that architecture deals with all the sciences regarding the building construction and materials, the nature around, the people inside and the people outside. Above all these points that were discussed before, we have to understand that architecture is primarily an artistic activity. We will see why it is so with the explanation before. Every architectural problem is a design problem which doesn't have a single solution. There are always many solutions to a design situation. Also, we can understand that every solution can be attained with many ways of process of designing. So, in the choice of designing, an architect has to be very creative in his decision, so that the outcome is very beautiful and artistic. We can explain this point with one more example. For example, if you take a production and design of a car is scientifically analyzed and designed very beautifully, solving all the functions, but it is mass produced and it is being used by people of different places and of different characters. But architecture can't work like this, because architecture is not a commodity like a car. It's not a commodity like a television. Architecture has to be very individualistic, has to be very subjective. A house has to be very different according to the places where it is located, according to the person who are using it. So architecture cannot be mass produced. It has to be approached in a very artistic manner. So we can conclude by saying this following points, that architecture uses the philosophic wholesomeness of humanities, the logics of science, the imagination of art, and the resources of technology. By using all these four aspects, architecture becomes complete. Now we will see about the profession of architecture itself, so as to get a better understanding of the field of architecture. How does an architecture office look like? Who all works in an architecture office? Is it done by a single person who is working as an artist very creatively, or is it has many people working with him? Obviously, architecture is a teamwork. It has to involve many persons who work with the chief architect. This image shows the very famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright sitting and discussing with his junior architects and other special consultants, discussing about an architectural design. We will see point by point whom all an architectural team comprise of, whom all a building construction team comprise of. Architect plays a central pivotal role, controlling all the following persons in a construction team. The first person is the client. The next person is the contractor who designs the building. The other person is a structural engineer who makes sure the building stands very stable. The fourth person is the MEP guy, that is the mechanical, electrical and plumbing consultant, who makes sure the service is running very fine. The other consultant is the heating, ventilation and air conditioning consultant. The other one is the project management consultant. All these people together forms the building construction team. They make sure the building is built exactly the way the architect has visualized it, so that it works perfectly as an organism. If we see further, we can understand the architecture profession doesn't stop in architecture itself. Through the history till present, architecture have more demands, and it have grown to the development of branching out itself into many other small fields. For example, an architecture in a big campus will involve other related fields like landscape architecture. It will involve an urban designer, it will involve an interior designer and all these consultants. Landscape architect is the one who concerns about the spaces, open spaces around the building and inside the building. An interior designer is the one who concern about the decoration and the beautification of the spaces inside the architecture. An urban designer comes into play when architecture has to be designed in the scale of a city or an urban scape. If we go further to the next level, somebody have to design a town, entire town. It has to have a specialized person who is a town planner involving in it. So if you see, a small design of architecture have developed and grown itself into a landscape architect, and then to an urban designer, and then further to a town planner and a city planner. So this is the entire vast range that architecture have developed into. We had seen before who all involves in the construction process. Now actually we will see in detail the actual architectural design process. The first person an architect deals with is his clients. An architect has to sit and discuss with client, and he have to understand all his spatial requirement. He has to understand the financial capacity of the client. He also has to understand the psychological needs of the client. So if you see, it is both the qualitative and also the quantitative aspects he have to completely understand from the client. After understanding all this, an architect has to think and process the architecture design so as to give a very good building. But there will be some cases where the client may not know what they want. So at that point, an architect has to help the client to understand what he needs. For example, sometimes the client may not know about the estimate of the project, so that the architect has to come and help him understand this is how, and within this how the architecture project will be possible. He have to make the client understand about the climate and other aspects of the building construction so that the building product will be good. But there are some other cases in which the client will be much more well informed than the architect himself. The client will have a very good vision about how the architecture has to be and how it will be used. In that case, the architect should not be egoistic. He have to interact with the client, he had to incorporate the ideas of the client, and he has to help the client to visualize and materialize the project. We have example for this process of architect and client relation from history. For example, in history, if you see, the client or the patron of architecture is himself called the architect. The architect will not be known much. For example, in case of Taj Mahal in northern India and Brihadishwara temple in southern India, the architect is not well known. Only the patron or the client, in previous case it is Shah Jahan, in the later case it is Rajaraja Cholan. Clients are known as the architects in that case. We have example from the present day history also. Here we have an example of a beautiful campus for the education of dance and music. This is the campus of Kalakshetra in Chennai. Here the actual client was the famous dancer and pioneer Rukmini Arundale. She had a great vision about bringing up the profession of dance of Bharatanatyam all over India. She had a vision of creating a campus for education of the classical dance and music. She collaborated with the builders and architect and created a very beautiful space as you are seeing in this picture. In this picture you can understand the classrooms are not happening inside the building. The majority of the learning space are happening outside the built space, which is the natural environment. Only certain important spaces like auditorium or built architecture. Such beautiful architecture is possible only if an architect takes the idea of clients who are the visionaries about the project. So you can understand the architect has to collaborate with the client, not only client, he had to collaborate and take ideas from professionals like what we have seen before, the landscape architect, the urban designer and town planner. He had to take all their ideas and incorporate, and then so as to he can make a very beautiful architecture. And also he has to make sure the work is done properly by the consultants and the contractor so that the visionary architecture is executed in its reality. In our country, the profession of architecture is governed by a council called the Council of Architecture. In fact, there is an act that is passed in the parliament regarding the architecture profession, because architecture profession is a very responsible profession. Now we will see the next aspect of the origin of architecture by asking the question, how architecture might have originated in the history. In the previous session we saw about how architecture is presently there. So now we have to see how it might have originated. If we see a small settlement, like in this example of the settlement in Nilgiris by a community of people called Todas, there are no specialized professional architects that have played a role in that building of their houses. There are no architects that have played a role in the construction of their houses. Only the people of the community themselves form together a group. Whenever they need a house, they build their house. But the same activity can't happen if the settlement have grown bigger to the level of a civilization. For example, if you take in history, the Roman civilization and also the Greek civilization had grown to a bigger level that people themselves can't afford to build their buildings in such large scale. So at that point, actually the specialized profession called architecture evolved by itself. There were people who were dedicated to design buildings and to construct buildings. In fact, the civilization were complex enough and the architectural profession have grown to a higher level, so as people had written books and treatises about architecture. For example, this is a book called The 10 Books on Architecture, written by the author called Vitruvius during the Roman Augustus Caesar rule. This book discusses all the aspects of architecture, its construction, the people using in it, and also importantly it says about how an architect has to be educated. So you can understand how complex the architecture field was even some 2000 years before. The history continued. The architecture profession was even developed during the period of Renaissance. For example, if you see the city of Florence, there were great architects like Michelangelo, Bernini and Borromini living in that period of Renaissance in Florence. There were established institutions that were teaching architecture along with the arts of sculpture and painting. During Renaissance and even after Renaissance, architecture was a very competitive field. There were architecture competitions that were announced and people were competing for it. So far we have seen how the architecture profession have evolved in history, and even before that we have seen how the architecture profession is presently in our country. So with this we are completing the first part of our discussion. We can review our discussion by asking certain simple questions which you can try to answer by yourself. Is architecture only about designing buildings? If not, explain why. What all branches of science the study of architecture deals with? Explain why architecture is essentially an art. Whom all an architecture team comprise of? When was the first treatise of architecture written in history? With this, now we come to the end of the session. Thank you.